as part of the series. And then I think someone else is doing the second epistle next week, if I'm not mistaken. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So this first intro slide just has an icon that I really love on the right there of Christ walking on water and asking Peter if he wanted to do the same, and kind of just gives us a little background on Peter and his experiences and his firsthand encounters with Christ, and how that potentially shaped his teaching, his preaching, and his writings. Um, go to the next slide. Maybe there we go. So a little bit of backstory on St. Peter. So as you may know, he was a fisherman by occupation. He was the brother of St. Andrew, and at first they were both disciples of John the Baptist, and they were later called to be disciples of Christ. Of course, they abandoned everything and ended up following him. And when Christ asked the disciples what they thought of him in Matthew 16, Peter replied, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." He was always very enthusiastic and very, right there. And Jesus answered him, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." And that sure enough, ended up happening. Peter was also at the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor. Um, uh, and he was also at the scene of the resurrection of Jairus's daughter. And finally, he was also at Christ's most agonizing moments at Gethsemane before the crucifixion. So he got to experience miracles. He got to experience walking on water. He experienced transfiguration. He experienced Christ's pain. He firsthand, he visibly saw it. And he was very explosive and very defensive when Jesus told his disciples that they would all abandon him. And he declared, as you recall, that he would never desert him. I will never, I'll never leave you. But Jesus told him later that you're actually going to deny me 3 times. And sure enough, he did without realizing it. And once he was aware of it, he wept bitterly. So he's a very interesting character. He was restored after Christ's resurrection to his apostolic office, and on Pentecost, he was amazing. He preached to the multitude, converted 3,000 that came and believed, and these 3,000 became sort of the nucleus of the first church of Jerusalem. And it was all because of St. Peter. And afterwards, he continued preaching and traveling fearlessly to many different parts of Asia Minor. And during the reign of King Nero, when all the persecution exploded, and then he was arrested and suffered a martyr's death, as we're aware. So that's just a little bit of background about the author of this particular epistle or letter that we're going to get into. And then just a little bit of background on the epistle itself or the letter. So if we look, it's unanimously agreed upon that St. Peter himself is the author. So there is some thought and thinking about some of the other epistles, St. Paul and such, that maybe he wasn't directly the author, but this one actually, I think it's unanimously agreed on that he himself was the author. And his style is really in harmony with the sermons that he gave that were recorded in the book of Acts around Pentecost. This epistle was written during between the years 63 and 67 AD. So again, during the reign of Nero, during the persecution. And after he helped establish the church in Antioch, he preached to the Jews throughout Asia Minor. And later, when he heard that the churches in Asia Minor, so we're talking about sort of this area here that you see on the map, when he heard that the churches there were being persecuted, he wrote them this letter of encouragement. And that's kind of what the letter is really all about. Is encouraging the churches and the Christians, the early Christians in Asia Minor, because they were being persecuted. And so if we look just kind of at a high level, the outline of the first epistle, so really the big thing is that he's writing to these early Christians who are suffering persecution, and he's telling them to remember to live in their baptism, and that the baptism is a death and a resurrection. So, when we baptize either infants or adults, there's the 3 times where we say, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And the third time, the person, the baby or the adult, is completely submerged underwater. So it's the death, and then they come up, and it's the resurrection. And Christians have to enter this unjust suffering, with spirit and anticipation of death and resurrection. So the whole point of the first epistle is really to remind these early Christians that being baptized into Christianity comes with suffering, and without suffering and death, there is no resurrection. And so this is kind of the reminder of that. And he talks a lot about the fulfillment of baptism. And again, the end result, the end goal is heaven, is salvation. So we say at the end of the creed, we look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the age to come. That's what we're all sort of headed towards. And that's what he's reminding everybody of. And so if you look at the epistle, there's only 5 chapters. It's really short. But he talks about, in order for us to achieve our salvation, for us to achieve the fulfillment of our baptism, that is death and resurrection, we have to be committed, or, he's writing to the early Christians, but for us, we have to be committed to a few different things. And the first of which is holiness. And we'll go into some of these a little bit later on. So commitment to holiness, a commitment to submission to the various roles in our lives, whether we're husbands or wives or priests or servants or teachers or masters, whatever we are, we have to submit to those different roles in our lives. But also patient suffering in this age in preparation for the age to come. And finally, he addresses unity in the church in the very last chapter. So we'll go through some of these. And I tried to find kind of a common thread. Like I said, it's really hard to kind of put together a talk on an entire epistle. So this is my first stab at it, but I tried to find a common thread. And to me, in reading this and reading, additional sources, I found that I think the theme is really the challenges and benefits of salvation. Like, it doesn't come easy. And really, I think on a more, if we drill down, it's really about how to be joyful or how to rejoice in suffering, which is kind of contradictory. And so I'm going to kind of try to make the case that this is the main theme and try to build, use some of the texts to support this particular sort of thesis, if you will. And so just kind of keep this theme in mind as we go through, and see if I actually, if it actually makes sense to you. So the first thing that he opens with, which there's a few like lines in there in the epistle that I really, really loved. And the first one is that he refers to Christians, the early Christians, as pilgrims. The very first line in chapter 1, verse 1, he addresses the epistles to the pilgrims of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So he calls them pilgrims. And I found this very interesting because he did it again in chapter 2, verse 11. He says, "Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims." And this idea of a sojourner or a pilgrim, I thought was really interesting and kind of a good reminder that Christians are actually called to live as sort of sojourners, pilgrims, or aliens in some way, right? A pilgrim or a sojourner or an alien is someone who's in a strange place, and who doesn't really stay for a long time. There's no intention of permanent residence there, right? And it's kind of like we're on a layover, if you will, and we missed our flight or something. So we're waiting for the next flight out. And it reminded me also, again, that we read in 1 John 2:17, the world is passing away and its desires, but the one who does the will of God abides forever. So it's just a reminder that St. Paul starts out by saying, by the way, you are pilgrims, you are sojourners. This is a strange place. This is not your um, permanent destination. And so this pilgrimage is not based on our temporal life, but rather something much better. And it really is telling about our belonging to the kingdom of the heavenly Christ, right? So, and we say in Philippians 3:20, our citizenship is in heaven, right? So, the first sort of really interesting part that stuck out to me was this concept of being pilgrims. If we look, St. John Climacus actually also addresses this. There's a quote from him. He says, "Being pilgrims means forsaking all temporal matters on earth, which hinder achieving our goal in the spiritual life. Pilgrimage is a humble behavior, hidden wisdom, knowledge about which most people do not know, hidden life, unseen goal, invisible meditation, longing for humility, desire for suffering, permanent determination on God's love, abundant blessings, rejecting vainglory, deep silence. So again, being a pilgrim is not, someone who's always on the move or who doesn't have a permanent home. It's not easy. And he highlights that being a pilgrim involves suffering, and surely St. Peter addresses that. And so the pilgrimage of suffering then is really carrying our human soul with all of the energy that we have to get through all of these sufferings that are in this temporal life, and all of the tribulations and all of the trials and all the things that we're struggling with for the love of the Holy Trinity. Like we really, when you don't suffer for something unless you really love it, whether you're a parent, whether you are someone who is courting someone, whether you are married, whether you have a really good friend, you don't suffer for someone unless you truly love them. And that's what this pilgrimage is all about, is really, sort of carrying ourselves through all of this in order to express and show our love of the Holy Trinity, the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit. And St. Peter goes on in this epistle then to address how we maintain our identity and our status as these quote unquote exiles or pilgrims in the world. And in reading it, it really, what struck me is that it really all centers around sacrifice. Sacrifice of my will and my ego, sacrifice of my humility, a sacrifice of good deeds, sacrifice of my flesh, and a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving. And if you look, Father Tedros Meliti goes into a lot of detail on each one of these, and these are kind of his also assessments of the different sacrifices that we make as being pilgrims in this world. And so then all of these correspond to the spirit of the epistle, which is really directed towards suffering people. And that's what was happening to the people in Asia Minor, these early Christians. And St. Peter really had to, address this with them. So one question that I had when going through this is, well, why does salvation even come with suffering? Like, why do we have to suffer? Why is it coupled with suffering? And if we look in the text and we dig a little deeper, salvation is invaluable, right? And it's in chapter 1, verses 18 and 19, St. Peter writes, "You were not redeemed with corruptible things like gold or silver, but with the precious blood of Christ." Um, St. Athanasius on the Incarnation also addresses this. He says, "Through this union of the immortal Son of God with our human nature, all men were clothed with incorruption in the promise of the resurrection." So salvation is not something small. It's not, it's something that is incorruptible. It is something that is so precious and so, you can't put a value on it. It you know, if we look at Father Tedros Meliti, he says, "One pays silver or gold to free the captives of war. However, the Lord did not pay silver nor gold to redeem us from our aimless conduct, but he presented his precious blood, the sufferings which the Son of God has endured and which led to the reproach of the cross." So gold or silver, these are just things that will eventually, disintegrate, and that's what you use to pay for a prisoner of war. But this is something so much more. So salvation, which has been granted to us, has been granted by something so much more valuable, which is the precious blood of Jesus Christ. And so that's what makes, salvation kind of worth it, and why it's coupled with suffering. Salvation requires a brand new creation, right? So the only way for us to be saved was to be recreated, was to be reborn, to have this new birth through the baptism, in which we put on Christ. Um, and I did a lot of digging trying to link this to the incarnation, just given the season that we're in. And there's a really good analogy in there of, when an artist paints a portrait of someone and that portrait eventually, gets stained. The only way to fix it really is to bring that person back and paint it again. And so that's essentially this, new creation of salvation, that Christ had to come and for us to actually be born again. And this new creation or this new birth, with any new birth comes growing pains. If you think about it just in the very literal sense, a newborn baby, in in a way that we're not necessarily, newborns in like as humans, but we're newborns in our spiritual lives. And so all of that comes with growing pains. And all of that also comes with the responsibility as children of God. And that's not easy. None of that is easy. And so that's why there is suffering, right? There's pain and growing and learning and experiencing and falling and making mistakes and doing all of that. By man, death has gained power over men, but man by the word made man, death has been destroyed and life raised up anew. So again, it goes back to, if we look in chapter 1, verse 23, St. Peter writes, having been born again, not of corruptible seed, but incorruptible through the word of God, which lives and abides forever. So again, this corruptible versus incorruptible. The incorruptible is, the salvation that we receive, and that of course comes with suffering, unfortunately, but fortunately. Um, and so the reason that we can become like him, Christ, is because he became like us. And we can become like him because he became like us. And that's what, is granted to us, both in the birth, the death, and the resurrection of Christ. And that's why really salvation comes with suffering. There's a lot of work, and there's a lot of trials and tribulations that we have to go to get to where we are trying to go. Hopefully that made sense. And so the salvation and the suffering, all of that, then, in order to get to salvation, we have to share in the sufferings of Christ. And I think there's sort of three things that I thought about. And first is, well, why do I want to share in this suffering, and what am I suffering for? And St. Peter talks a little bit about that. And then the second, which we'll spend a lot of time on, is how do we suffer? Because this letter is really talking about rejoicing in sufferings, and St. Peter kind of goes through a whole bunch of different ways that people suffer. And then the third sort of theme then is striving for salvation. So there's sort of three aspects of sharing in the sufferings of Christ. What are we suffering for? How do we suffer? And then the strive or the drive towards salvation. So what are we suffering for? So we talked a little bit about it earlier when we talked about it was for salvation. But if we dig down a little bit into the epistle, then in chapter 1, verse 7, through baptism, we are born into suffering and the resurrection of Christ. So the suffering is part of the testing of our faith. So if we look at chapter 1, verse 7, St. Peter writes, in this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it be tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So it's the analogy of gold being put into the fire to become more pure, and that's what Saint Peter is telling us and telling the early Christians, is that um, gold that has become that has been put in the fire becomes more pure, can withstand the test of trials and afflictions, and grow in firmness and genuineness and purity. And so, one of the things we are suffering for then is to really test our faith and to become stronger and to become more pure. The other thing we're suffering for, St. Peter writes about, is this inheritance. Again, it's this theme of this incorruptible. So he writes in verses 3-5, an inheritance incorruptible, undefiled, that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you, who are kept by the power of God through faith for salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time. So we're suffering to get this inheritance, not an inheritance as we would normally think of one, but an incorruptible inheritance that does not fade away, that is reserved for us in heaven. That's a wonderful thing. I'm glad it's reserved, but it's going to take some suffering, right? So I'm suffering to obtain the joy and the blessings of eternal life. And so again, he's reminding the people, like, there is more than just the trials and tribulations that you are going through. Keep your eye on the prize. And the suffering is unto glory and salvation. So in verse 9 of chapter 1, St. Peter writes, receiving the end of your faith, the salvation of your souls. So the salvation is a work in progress, right? He talks about, it's about loving and trusting and rejoicing in Christ now, so that the end goal is this full and final salvation, right? So that he's kind of explaining to them, like, this is all really hard right now and you're suffering, but it's for a good reason, and there is much better prepared for you in the end. He goes on and he talks, so salvation comes when we allow Christ to work internally within us. So sowing love and confidence and joy that goes against the stream of secularism. So if we, think about the analogy of the fish that swims upstream, you know, salvation comes to us when we allow Christ to work to help us to go against the stream of secularism and godlessness and worldliness, which is basically all around us in society and has pretty much always been around. St. Peter emphasizes that Christianity is first and foremost a matter of the heart. And this is really beautiful. He continues in chapter 1, verse 8, when he's telling them, that you are much more precious than gold that perishes, though it's tested by fire. He says, may it may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ, whom having not seen you love, though now you do not see him, yet believing you rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of glory, receiving the end of your faith, the salvation of your souls. So it has nothing to do with, what we see or what we experience with our senses, but Christianity and salvation is only experienced through all the matters of the heart, right? And this mystery of salvation, that is awaiting us was foretold by the prophets, and he talks about that in verses 10 to 12 of chapter 1. And this mystery of salvation, this incorruptible, beautiful place in heaven that is reserved for us, is so great that even the angels, he says, would wish to know about it in detail but do not. So it's this mystery that the prophets foretell and the angels know nothing about, but it's a wonderful thing that awaits us. And so this is the kind of thing that gives us the hope of, why am I suffering here? Why am I a pilgrim? Why am I an exile? Why am I an alien in this temporal place, going through all of the things that I'm going through, in the same way that these early Christians suffered as well? There's much more. There's much more to look forward to. So how do we suffer? And we suffer in a lot of different ways, as did the early Christians. And I think the suffering happens through submission and sacrifice. So if we go through now and we kind of look at the different kinds of suffering that the early Christians were experiencing, which we all experience today. One of the ways we suffer is, he talks about in chapter 2, verse 11, is in abstaining from fleshly lusts. He says, beloved, I beg you again, as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. Abstaining from fleshly lusts is a struggle. It's a suffering, right? Being able to submit or redirect my senses and my passions to that which glorifies God is a struggle. It's a suffering because of everything that's around us that's telling us to do the opposite. And so that sacrifice and that submission is part of our suffering and is part of our journey. He also talks in chapter 2, verse 13, about submitting to civil government. So even that, he says, therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king supreme or to the governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. He tells them, honor all people. And so he talks here about, submitting to the government. And Tertullian also addresses this. He says, regarding proper honor for kings and emperors, it is very clear that we have to be in complete obedience, as the apostle commanded us to be subject to rulers and authorities. However, there are limits to this obedience, which is to keep ourselves from worshiping idols. So some of us may feel like we are, suffering with for example, the current election. Like, wow, this guy's got to be my president now. I'm not so happy. Or, the previous, administration or whatever it is. But submitting to civil government is in some way a suffering and a submission, because whoever's in charge, we have to, St. Peter writes, we have to be, subject to our rulers and to our authorities. And the limit to that obedience, of course, then is to keep ourselves from worshiping idols. So if you remember, for example, King Nebuchadnezzar and the three holy youth, that was the line that they wouldn't cross, and that's why they got thrown into the fire. And so, then another sort of way to suffer is submitting to our civil governments. He talks also, like I just read in verse 17 of chapter 2, to honor everyone, honor all people. That is a struggle. To honor everyone, no matter what. Love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. That's suffering, in my opinion. It's really hard to honor everyone. It's really hard to find the good in everyone. It's really, we all have, you know, the struggle to make sure that we treat everyone well. And the reason that we need to honor everyone is because, in spite of all the corruption that human nature has undergone, the divine image is there in the deep parts of each human being. And I think, St. Peter, when he says honor everyone, love the brotherhood, it's really a call for us to suffer and submit and really sacrifice, and try to find the divine image in each and every human being. So yeah, that's a struggle, that's a suffering. Um, and he also then discusses submitting to masters. In verse 18, he says, servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. So, these can be servants to their masters. It could be employee to boss, if we take it to modern day. And he says, submit to your master, not only the good and gentle ones, but also the harsh ones. For this is commendable, if because of conscience towards God one endures grief and suffering wrongfully. For what credit is it if when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? You deserved it, obviously. But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. So it's a struggle for us to submit to masters, to bosses, to people who are not so kind to us, who are in charge of us. And it's a suffering. And St. Peter addresses that, for us to be submissive and to suffer through that, because it is commendable before God if we take it patiently. And then he spends a lot of time talking about spouses submitting to each other. He talks about wives submitting to their husbands, which we hear a lot during the wedding ceremony, and people are always giggling. Wives to be submissive to their husbands, and he talks about obeying as Sarah obeyed Abraham. He also discusses for women their adornment, that it not be only on the outside, taking care of our hair and wearing gold and putting on really nice clothes, but rather it's really what's inside of our hearts. Again, the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit he talks about. And he talks about, the different roles, not only for wives, but also for husbands. And he talks about that, it's reciprocal, and there's a reciprocal faith. And when a woman or a wife is submissive, and she can be a really good example for her husband. So he addresses again the role of wives and husbands, the reciprocal faith, the devotion to one another, the husband to give honor to the wife, to dwell with them with understanding, and to honor each other. And he talks about that in chapter 3, verses 1-7. So, and this is a suffering, believe it or not. If you're married, married life is not easy. It's not easy to submit to one another. It's not easy to honor one another all the time. Um, you know, it might be nice in the first year or two, and then it gets hard. There's nothing easy about it. And really, maintaining that and continuing that is a suffering, and it is a struggle. Not that marriage is suffering, but it's all about submission and sacrifice. I can definitely say that. And so St. Peter addresses that again. So there's all these different ways that we suffer, whether it's in the flesh or in submission to authorities or having to honor everyone, even if we don't necessarily like them very much, or our bosses or our spouses. Um, these are all different ways that we suffer. And clearly, people in early Asia Minor, early Christians also suffered. So we're not alone. I mean, this has been going on for a long time. Um, and there's more. In chapter 3, verse 8, he talks about the suffering that comes with submitting our pride and our desires. He says, be of one mind, um, having compassion for one another, love as brothers, be tenderhearted, be courteous, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing, knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing. This is hard, and this is suffering. Having compassion for one another, being of one mind, being tenderhearted, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling. That's a lot. That's really submitting my pride, my desire, my ego. Blessing someone who is reviling me. That's pretty hard. That's a pretty tough pill to swallow. But again, St. Peter reminds us that this is part of the suffering that we need to go through in order for us to really show our love for the Trinity, in order for us to be renewed, live in our baptism, remind ourselves of the salvation that we are suffering for. In chapter 3, verse 17, another way that we suffer is by having to submit to good conduct. It's hard to be good. Um, we're not only to be called Christians, but to be Christians. So there's two different things, right? I can call myself a Christian, but St. Peter is saying in chapter 3, verse 17, he says, for it is better if it is the will of God to suffer for doing good than doing evil. So I can't just be a Christian by name. I have to be a Christian in my actions, and to constantly strive to do the will of God and to suffer for that, rather than to take the easy way out and not necessarily do evil, but not do good. So submitting to making the decision to do what is right, which is never hard, it's hardly ever easy, is a type of suffering. And then a really big one that he goes into in chapter 4 then is subduing our vices. We all have vices. I get angry too quickly. I don't have patience. I don't have self-control. I can't fast. I love to go out drinking. Whatever it may be, everyone has a vice, or vices, and subduing those and crucifying our passions, if you will, is really, really hard to do. And that's I think for me one of the biggest ways that we all suffer. St. Peter says, therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind. For he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. And chapter 4, verse 3, he says, for we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles. And he goes on to list all of the vices: lewdness, lusts, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. So clearly, the early Christians had a lot of issues with partying and drinking, um, but these are vices that they were dealing with, and we all have our own vices now. And so Saint Peter, is really encouraging them to avoid everything connected to our previous life. That's what baptism, again, this renewal, this new creation that comes with it. This responsibility, this submission, this suffering, it's about abandoning all of, these things that we have done in our past lifetime prior to our baptism, prior to our new life. And again, subduing these is a type of suffering that we're all going through. And then in chapter 5, he talks a little bit about submitting to our elders and our overseers. Suffering as a church, the elders, the people who are shepherding us, who are shepherding us as the flock of God. People who, our servants, our priests, our bishops, all of the leaders. Submitting to them is also a type of suffering, because again, anytime I have to submit to someone and I have to, turn away from what I want. It's a type of suffering. He tells uh, the early Christians in verse 5, likewise, you younger people, submit yourself to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So as a church, we all have to submit to each other, young, old, dressed in black or not dressed in black. We have to submit to one another, be submissive to one another, and clothed with humility. And that's hard. It's really hard for me to submit to someone else um, for anything, and that's in and of itself a suffering. As a church together, as a community, to submit to one another. I'm almost done, I promise. There's clearly a lot of suffering here. In chapter 5, verses 6 through 8, again, he kind of addresses submitting our will and our cares. And this is a big one. He says, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion. So again, submitting my will, my desires, my cares um, to God's will and God's desire and God's cares, and being sober and vigilant. This is really, really hard. And this is, all of the trials that we endure have a way of threatening to break us, right? The things that we worry about all the time, we agonize about, we're sad about, we're worried about, we're fearful about, a lot of times we become consumed. And I mean, look at the time that we're in right now, a global pandemic, everyone's worried what's going to happen next. The economy, my family, the sickness, we all haven't been at church together. I miss people, my children, my parents, they can't get sick. We're all consumed, right? And so all the different trials have a way to sort of, they threaten to break us. And so I think St. Peter is really telling us and reminding us, and it's very relevant to today, is just humble yourself, that he may exalt you in due time. Cast all your care upon him. Easier said than done, obviously. I can totally attest to that. But I think we have to continually remind ourselves of this, humble yourself, cast your care upon him, and not to become consumed with all of the different trials that we are enduring. There's a really good book I was going to recommend for potential another book club. It's called Renewing You. It's by a priest, Reverend Dr. Nicholas Lowe, and Dr. Roxanne, his wife, who's a psychiatrist or psychologist. And it has a really good section on, how to deal with trials and vices and tribulations. And it goes through kind of a step-by-step of how to do that. I totally, totally recommend it. I'm still getting through it. But again, just a reminder of, everybody's in the same boat, everybody's suffering, and we just have to throw our cares upon him. This part about be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion. Peter writes how important it is to watch over our own thoughts. And our thoughts are sort of this battlefield of spiritual warfare that exists in our mind. And again, in the book that I just referred to, Renewing You, it talks about this, how our thoughts are kind of the place where these things start. And this is the place where the devil starts. And he uses our reasoning and all the arguments that we make to ourselves about situations as sort of the jumping off point or the platform to launch his attack. So he knows that we use reasoning and arguments and logic and the things that we try to convince ourselves of. And he uses that as sort of like, okay, I'm going to use this, your logic and your reasoning, to start chipping away and attacking at us and making us feel helpless and sad and depressed and alone. And that's sort of the tactic there. And so St. Peter is telling us, be sober and be vigilant and sort of be in touch with our thoughts, because that's where things are going to get started. And that's how it's sort of like a little termite. I have termites in my house right now, so it just reminded me of that. But it's sort of like little termites that start to sort of chip away and eat away. And so we need to be sober and vigilant. And the devil, I mean, the way he works is he sort of explores each of us individually, right? And he's looking for the weak part. He's, walking about like a roaring lion. The roaring lion is looking for the weakest animal to go after, right? He looks for, okay, who's my easy target? And that's kind of how the devil explores each of us. He looks for our weak spots, appeals to our senses, again, our reasoning, our arguments, and it's sort of really like tailored. He's a very smart guy. And it's sort of specifically geared towards what tempts us, right? So for even for Christ, when Christ fasted and went into the wilderness and he was tempted by the devil, the temptations were specifically geared towards Christ, right? Like he was hungry, so he tempted him with bread. He was, he tempted him with power. He tempted him, with pride. And so it's specifically geared towards each and every one of us and what is going to get us. And when he's unable to tempt us, then he brings, forth this threat of persecution, a threat of suffering, so that fear causes us to betray our faith. And so, again, as St. Peter writes, we have to be alert for these sort of multifaceted attacks and ready to resist at every single turn, because he's like a roaring lion, is going to be looking for the weak link, the weak spot. So this is all part of our suffering. It's pretty hard, being a Christian and looking towards the incorruptible, um, and um, there's nothing easy about it. And I think St. Peter addresses all of these and kind of really encourages and says, be aware, be alert, know that, Christ has come and has suffered before you, and there is something to look forward to, and you're doing it for a reason. And so the last part then is really about, what are we suffering for and how do we suffer? And it's really about, striving towards salvation. So we talked a lot about the challenges of salvation. And so I think we're going to maybe go now into sort of the benefits. We talked about first, being dedicated to holiness. We talked about suffering through submission and sacrifice. And then I want to talk just a little bit, as we round out the epistle here, sort of things that are a little bit more positive, and some other parts of the epistle that I didn't address that I'm saving for here that I really fell in love with. The first, as we strive for salvation, and we strive to obtain the benefits, are one is desiring the word, and the second is becoming living stones. So there are two really important things and parts of the epistle I didn't cover. So this first part about desiring the word, again, I found this verse it really hit home for me. In chapter 2, if we go back to verses 1 to 3, St. Peter writes about desiring Christ. He says, therefore, laying aside all malice, all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and all evil speaking, as newborn babes, desire the pure milk of the word, that you may grow thereby, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is gracious. This concept of a newborn baby desiring the pure milk of the word was just so beautiful to me. And when you dig down a little bit and you think about it, um, newborn infants, that's all they drink. That's all they eat. It's the milk from the mother. And so the analogy of a new birth after baptism falls right in line with that, right? As I'm an infant, I'm a spiritual infant. I'm at the beginning of my spiritual age, and I need the spiritual milk. And the pure milk of the word, you can say, that is the word with a capital W, the Logos, Jesus Christ, and his pure instruction, right? And this is the instruction that we get, from the church and from the life of Christ. Um, and St. Peter writes, you have to lay aside evil, malice, envy. These are the things that hinder our spiritual growth. They sort of stunt our growth, and they cannot exist in this pure spiritual milk. I love this analogy a lot, and I don't know if it's because I'm a mom or what it is, but it's just really beautiful, and it sort of returns us all to this infant stage of our spiritual lives. And I think St. Peter really talks about it in this way, because these are new Christians. They are newly baptized, and he's reminding them, like, as an infant craves milk, we have to crave the milk of the word, which is Jesus Christ. Father Tedros Malati writes, the starting point is that the believer continuously realizes that he is a nursing baby. I think that's really powerful. If I just constantly remind myself, like, I'm just a baby in the faith, I'm just a baby in my spiritual life. Um, it'll keep me coming back, to the church for the milk. It will keep me coming back to Jesus Christ for this pure spiritual milk. Um, and Father Tedros talks a little bit about, the church providing that milk. So does Saint Clement of Alexandria. He says, it, or the church, is the milk of love. Blessed is he who nurses from it. Again, this analogy of, being spiritual infants and nursing from the church, this pure milk. This is the way that we grow in our spirituality, and this is the way that we grow towards salvation and we experience the benefits of salvation. The church offers us all of these different things, right? We have the rituals, we have fasting, we have, prayers, we have teachings, we have, being present in church, we have communion, we have intercessions of the saints. We have all of these different ways that we can partake and experience and taste of this milk. And these are and this is what is going to get us through all of the sufferings that St. Peter outlines and discusses, is really just, again, going back continuously as a nursing baby and never feeling like I know enough, I've had enough. A nursing baby has never had enough. They always keep going back for more. They'll stay on as long as they possibly can. If you're a mom, you know this. And spiritually, we have to kind of do the same thing, is just continuously come back and never be satiated and never feel like we're full. So then the question for us, and the question that pops up from this is, do I long for the word? Do I long for this milk? Do I desire it? So we shouldn't just settle or say, I'm not going to change. This is just the way I am. Sort of this spiritual fatalism, like there's no way, like this, I'm just too far away. I'm rusty. I'm going through a dry spell. Like, we shouldn't settle for it, right? It's not what God wants for us. That's again, kind of like the devil playing on our weakness and our logic and our, making an argument and kind of just chipping away at our thoughts. St. Augustine, in his book Confessions, he writes, "O God, that ever burnest and art never quenched, O charity, my God, enkindle me." Right? So, light this fire in me to desire you. Thou commandest continence, grant what thou commandest, and command what thou wilt. So St. Augustine talks about sort of asking for God to help, kindle that desire for the word and kindle that desire for the pure milk, as newborn infants. And so this idea of desiring the word is one of the ways that we help cope with the sufferings and find a way to fill ourselves with this pure milk of the word of Jesus Christ, in our new birth, in our new baptism, that is sort of the precursor to our suffering and our eventual resurrection and salvation. The other really neat passage talks about Christ as the chief cornerstone, which we've heard, and talks about us as becoming living stones. So in chapter 2 as well, right after he talks about us being newborn babes, he says, coming to him as to a living stone, rejected indeed by men, but chosen by God and precious. You also, as living stones, are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And then he says, therefore it is contained in the scripture, behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect, precious, and he who believes on him will by no means be put to shame. And this is in chapter 2, verse 6. So I want to talk a little bit about a cornerstone and a living stone, and dive a little bit into that. And when I think about when he says, behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone. And we've heard this before. A cornerstone, when you think about it, is the stone that forms the base of a corner of a building. It's kind of important. It joins two walls, for example. And Christ is, it makes sense because Christ is that cornerstone, or that intersection for us between heaven and earth, between mankind and God. He's sort of the intermediary. And so the entire spiritual building of the church is founded on Christ. And then he says, therefore, to you who believe, he is precious, but to those who are disobedient, the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone, a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, in chapter 2, verse 7. And this is really referring to then that the Jews knew him and crucified him. And, the whole world, St. Augustine says, heard about him and believed in him. So, the stone which the builders rejected, Jesus Christ, has become the chief cornerstone. And to those who don't believe, he is a stumbling block and a rock of offense. But to those who believe, um, he is truly that intersection. He is truly that cornerstone, and we will not be put to shame, as it says in chapter 2, verse 6. Um, and this idea of he is the cornerstone no matter what. There is nothing anybody can do about it, and human disbelief or unbelief doesn't frustrate or defeat the ultimate purpose of God. Right? If God plans for Jesus to be the chief cornerstone, humans can betray him, desert him, deny him, mock him, strike him, spit on him, hit him with rods, crown him, strip him, crucify him, bury him, but they can't stop him from being what God destined him to be, which is that living cornerstone to a great nation, right? Which is all of his followers. In chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, St. Peter writes to the early Christians, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, who had not obtained mercy, but have now obtained mercy. So again, this is an encouragement to the early Christians who are suffering. You are chosen, right? So you are a holy nation, his special people, and you have mercy. So, again, just sort of hang in there, right? Be that living stone. And so he's telling them and he's telling us we have to be these faithful living stones, no matter where we come from. We are united in a common faith, right? All part of this one building together, the spiritual building. In spite of all of the sorrows, all of the trials, all the persecution, we will triumph and conquer because Christ is our chief cornerstone. He's sort of that supporting initial in the foundation, and that will cause all of our enemies and all of our trials and all of our suffering to be put to shame. And so, as individuals, as families, as a church, as a nation, St. Peter tells us we should base our lives on this cornerstone in order for us to be victorious and triumph over all of our sufferings. Um, and I think in thinking about, becoming these living stones, one of the ways that we can do that is to really just going back to the beginning, reminding ourselves of our status as pilgrims. So it's really easy to get attached to this life, to the things of this life, to the temporary things. And one of the ways that we can become these living stones is really to remind ourselves that we are pilgrims, we are sojourners, we are exiles, we are aliens, and to not get assimilated and not get caught up in this. And this is I really wanted to tie this to the current season and the current time of year. And so forgive me if this is a stretch, but it's actually, thinking about it, it's challenging to not get attached and not to assimilate, especially during this time of year. If you think about this season, it's just laden with consumerism, right? Even before Christmas season begins, there's all the pre-holiday hysteria. I mean, you saw Christmas trees in Costco in like June, right? And all of this hysteria kind of conflicts with the nativity fast, which we are in, the preparation for the birth of Christ, which we are, supposed to be doing. The fast gives us this possibility to prepare properly, right? Um, and in fact, fasting during this time, which unfortunately this season has become secularized, fasting during this time when this has happened kind of really hones in on what is our position and asks us the question, who or what are we with? Am I with um, the sales and the deals? Am I with Santa Claus, New Year's Eve celebrations, fireworks, the whole world? Or am I with myself and with my soul in another place? I think having the fast during this time kind of helps us focus a little bit on, where am I? Like what's important right now during this season, and this is all temporal. I think that's one of the things for us to focus on during the fast is renewing, if you will, our pilgrimhood. I don't even think that's a word, but renewing that, reminder that we are pilgrims and not to get caught up in all of this hysteria. And really, using the fast as a time for us to think about who or what am I with? What am I doing? And if we reflect on it, it turns out we're not at all in this world to celebrate with everyone else, right? We're in this world to do something more and to achieve something more that is incorruptible, and that is reserved for us in heaven. So as modern Christians, this time of the fast is really just a little opportunity for us to have a personal confession before God. It allows us to see how much within me is secular and how much am I, strapped to my passions and the things that I want and the things that I need. And also kind of gives me an opportunity to sort of recalibrate and remind myself that we're all actually indeed pilgrims. So I guess the challenge then is to use this fast as a way to sort of renew our pilgrimhood that St. Peter talks about, and to renew our focus and to, suffer. It's not easy to be fasting during this time when everyone is eating and drinking and being merry, and you know, to to focus on, on what am I preparing for? And so, the challenge then to return to and to renew our pilgrimhood, I think is one of the things that I took away from trying to tie this into where we are, seasonally in the church. And so then to kind of wrap things up, I had a few kind of um, conclusions that I came up with, and that is that again, I'm going to tie it into the nativity because this is I'd like to tie it in seasonally to where we are, but the nativity should remind us that God the Son, Jesus Christ, in all of his holiness and his purity and his power has restored to us what was lost. And that's the presence of God in our lives, right? And that is the reminder of our baptism, our new life, um, and what we are headed towards. And the nativity also reminds us that death is overcome, the temporal and the eternal, and that our corruptible lives, like St. Peter talked about throughout his epistle, are made incorruptible through the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Before we were lost in all of our revelries and all of our past, habits that, St. Peter talks to the early Christians about. It's this empty, past human existence, and it's no more. So the Nativity reminds us of rebirth and a new creation, that has come to allow us to become these nursing infants again and give us opportunity to drink of the pure milk of the word. And our salvation is our new existence. So again, the theme of this transformation that begins with the new birth through our baptism, and then to achieve our salvation then is to enter into this new reality where there are challenges and suffering, right? So it's none of it is easy, but I think the nativity reminds us then, that with this new birth and this new life, um, it's not easy, but it gives us an opportunity to overcome our challenges and our sufferings. And St. Peter addresses each and every one of those in his epistle. And if we live in his promises, and St. Peter talks about this too, then we can endure and we can be victorious ultimately, um, um, in all of our sufferings. And so I think it, takes us to, again, that theme of like there's definitely benefits to salvation, and there are challenges to salvation. And um, I guess nothing good ever came easy. And you can think of all the cliches, no pain, no gain. You can think of all of them, but they're all actually true. And I think St. Peter really addresses all of those in his epistle. So I encourage you to read it. It's a really easy read. But yeah, that's all I have to share. I guess, do you have any questions, or I don't know if Abuna's still on, or if you have any comments to add? But that's all I wanted to share with you today. So glory be to God forever. Um, I don't know if Abuna's still there. I'm going to stop recording. Abuna.
That was a great talk.